Hello, this is a video for module TMM2051, New Testament Studies, and this is for week 8. And we're looking at St. Paul in the second half of this module, and in week 8 we're doing some work on issues in Paul, and we're considering men and women. So for this video, one of the things that we'll be asking you to do is to think not so much immediately how we might react to reading some of the things that we read in our key passages like 1 Corinthians 11:2-16, but rather asking this question of how we best frame them. What do I mean by that? Well, one of the things that's good to think about is that when we read, we're not just reading words on a page. We're reading them in a context. We immediately situate what we read in some sort of frame, and how we frame what we read will be key to what we get from the text. And a visual illustration of this would be, I think it's a good illustration, a zebra. If you put a zebra on a black background, what do you see? Well, you see white stripes, because the black background makes the black stripes fade. They're invisible, they don't stand out. But if you put the same zebra on a white background, what do you see? Well, the thing that you notice most is the black stripes, because, of course, against a white background, the white stripes fade. In reality, there's no difference. The zebra is the same zebra, but how you frame that zebra, how you visually frame it, is key to what you notice. And I think this is the same with our key texts. If we don't have some sort of context into which to put them, then we're going to put them in our context, and that's not a problem. But it might not be the best way of working out what Paul is trying to do. And so I want to show you a few texts, some which long predate Paul, some which are roughly contemporaneous with Paul, and some which illustrate how people interpreted some of these issues. So I'm just going to scoot over to my iPad. So here we are, and here's a text that long predates Paul. It's Genesis chapter 1. And why this is relevant is that, of course, in 1 Corinthians 11:7-10, Paul alludes to Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2. The allusion to Genesis chapter 1 is in 1 Corinthians 11:7. A man ought not to cover his head, being the image and glory of God. And the reference to the image of God is a reference to Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. Well, verse 26 and 27. And one of the things that modern readers struggle with in relation to Genesis and 1 Corinthians 11 is, well, hasn't Paul misread Genesis? And actually there's a real question there. This is the New Revised Standard Version, and you can see that the way that in which they've translated Genesis chapter 1 makes it very difficult to make sense of what Paul is doing in 1 Corinthians 11. Then God said, "Let us make humankind, male and female, in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." Then verse 27, "So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them." So far, so good. At which point Paul's application of image and glory of God to the man in 1 Corinthians 11:7, and then the contrast of that with the woman is the glory of man in 1 Corinthians 11:8, it just doesn't make sense. Isn't Paul misreading Genesis? Well, of course, he might be misreading Genesis, but it's worth reading Genesis carefully. Even in an English translation, most English translations will give you footnotes, and this is what these little letters are next to humankind here. So let's see what that says. Hebrew is Adam. So then God said, let us make Adam in our image, according to our likeness. Adam. So God created humankind in his image. Well, so God created Adam in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Well, let's see what that's... the Hebrew, it's him. Male and female, he created them. So why have the NRSV translators translated this particular text in this way? Well, it's worth bearing in mind that the Hebrew word Adam, man, or Adam, covers the same basic range of senses as the English word man prior to the advent of inclusive terms like humankind. Prior to the advent of the widespread use of humankind, man would sometimes be used to refer to an individual male human being, and then sometimes it would be used to refer to a kind of as a categorical designation. You know, man, Homo sapiens. And in fact, you know, this is the meaning of the word homo in Homo sapiens. It's a categorical designation referring to man. Personally, I much prefer humankind, but of course humankind makes it much more difficult to render the possibilities of the Hebrew text in English. And so what's happened is the NRSV translators have concluded that although Adam is used in verse 26 and verse 27, it's being used not as a designation for an individual human being, but as a categorical designation, the creation of human beings as a species. In this instance, the first couple. And so when they come to verse 27, so God created Adam in his image, in the image of God, he created him. Because they're translating Adam to mean mankind, humankind, yeah, they use a plural designation, but that plural designation isn't there in the text. It's a perfectly reasonable translation, but it's worth bearing in mind. That the text itself, the Hebrew text itself, is tolerant of more than one English translation. It'll tolerate an inclusive translation, but it'll also tolerate a translation which sees the first two lines of Genesis 1, 26 and 27, the first two lines of verse 27, as referring to the creation not of Adam qua species, but of Adam, the individual. And so I think Paul in 1 Corinthians 11 is reading Genesis 1 along those lines. The first two lines of Genesis 1:27, I think Paul is applying them to the creation of the male human being, Adam. So God created Adam in his image, in the image of God. He created him. And then there's the expansion in Genesis chapter 2 for Paul, which illustrates male and female, he created them. So Paul's reading the creation account in a very particular way, in a way that we don't tend to read them now, but in a way which the texts themselves don't resist. That's not to say that we should abandon our inclusive language translations of Genesis, but it is to say that it isn't obvious that Paul is making an exegetical error here. The text is tolerant of a wide range of readings. So that's the first text thing that I want to say, because this is an ancient text, and it's a key text because it's part of Paul's creation theology. Let's have a look at another. So what did ancient Greeks think about about men and women? Well, I'm going to take you, that's Philo. This is a text from Aristotle's Politics. You can see at the top of the screen it says Politics brackets English, and this is from Book 1 of Aristotle's Politics, and the reference is 1260a. And it's worth saying that ancient Greeks thought of the world in terms of three sets of relationships. There were households, and in the household there were three types of relationship. There was the relationship between the man and the woman, the conjugal relationship. There was the relationship between the master and the slave. And then there was the relationship between the parent and the child, the father and the child. And the Greek patriarch was, according to Aristotle, differentiated from these across these three different relationships in quite important ways. The free-born master married to a free-born woman was differentiated from her not because she was a kind of domestic slave. Aristotle regarded that as barbarous. Rather that that the master and the woman was free, but according to Aristotle was less or different. And here's one example of the way in which Aristotle framed this. There are by nature various classes of rulers and ruled. And Aristotle begins with barbarians. The free, the Greek, rules the slave, the barbarian. The male rules the female, and the man rules the child, but in a different way. All possess the various parts of the soul. So, women, slaves and children are all fully human, but they possess them in different ways. The slave has not got the deliberative part at all, but the free Greek female has it, but it lacks authority. And while the child has it, it is in an undeveloped form. And Aristotle here is thinking about the way in which the lordship of the master in the Greek household pans out across those different relationships. So, according to Aristotle, slaves are not fully rational, and therefore they can't decide what's good and pursue it. They need somebody to tell them what to do. Women are fully rational. They can decide what's good, but they're but their reason, according to Aristotle, lacks full authority, and so they need a master, but for a different reason than the slave. And children, well, they're incomplete, they're undeveloped, and in some respects they resemble slaves, but in important respects they will grow out of it. And so the master who rules must possess intellectual virtue in completeness, while each of the other parties must have that share of this virtue which is appropriate to them. Now, what does that mean? It means at some level that political differences, differences of class and ethnicity and gender and age, all of these categorical differences were, for Aristotle and for many Greeks generally, differences of nature. Differences of nature. And so, we might want to think about Galatians 3:26-28. What's going on there that Paul can declare these categories, which for Greek culture generally were rooted in differences of nature? What's going on there that Paul can declare these basically irrelevant to oneness in Jesus Christ? And isn't it interesting how only a few verses later Paul uses the illustration of being a child and being subject to instructors until the time at which we achieve maturity. It seems that at some level Paul is engaging with wider cultural ideas about natural differences within the household. Now, what does that mean in terms of men and women? Well, it means that there were widespread cultural assumptions that there were certain things that women couldn't do and that men had to instruct them to do or do for them. There were certain assumptions about the natures and predispositions and predilections of men and women, the vices that they tended towards, the virtues that were good for them. And there was a widespread assumption that tying people into a particular form of relationship was one of the ways of responding therapeutically to the way in which men and women were constituted. What does that mean? Well, it means at some level that there was that Greek culture and Roman culture and ancient cultures generally tended to idealize the adult freeborn male. That was the measure of a human being. And other human beings were lesser by comparison. And one of the critical questions in relation to Paul is, does Paul deny that, or does he argue that Christian salvation is a kind of fix for that? In other words, does Paul deny the hierarchical assumptions of the ancient world when it comes to the differences between men and women? Or does he assume those assumptions but say that in some sense, in the sacrifice of Jesus Christ and in the gift of the Holy Spirit and in the promise of the resurrection, that these basic natural limitations are overcome, and in a sense, in Christian salvation, women, children and slaves are rounded up. So in other words, are we created equal, or are we baptized into something which makes us equal? And is equal the best term for it? So those are some issues that arise from Aristotle. Let's think about behaviour. Here's a passage from Philo of Alexandria, and this is from a very common open domain text of Philo, and the reference is at the top of the page. The Special Laws, Book 3, it says 171, but we're beginning at 169. Philo is a Jewish writer, but he's thoroughly Hellenized. He works within a Greek context. And here's Philo talking about the distinctions between private and public space and some of the ways in which, men and women can engage with these spaces. So, marketplaces, council chambers, courts of justice, large companies, assemblies of numerous crowds, and a life in the open air full of arguments and actions relating to war and peace are suited to men. But taking care of the house, remaining at home, are proper duties of women. And virgins, that's unmarried girls, daughters basically, having their apartments in the centre of the house within the innermost doors, so you keep them safest, and full-grown women not going beyond the vestibule and outer courts. So you need to imagine a large ancient Greek house with an outer door, then an inner door, and then apartments on the inside. You put the daughters in the middle, as far from the outside as possible, and full-grown women don't go beyond. And in that sense, it may be that Philo here gives us some sort of illustration of how diaspora Jews and Greeks and Romans understood the way in which women were to engage with the various spheres of existence, private and public. I mean, it's clear at some point that women would go to the marketplace, but of course that might give some support indication of why they tended to veil when they were going out in public. It's almost like the veil is a private space that you wear. The assumption here is that a separation of spheres, men for the public, women for the private, men for the civic, women for the domestic. And we've already talked about the way in which honour and shame discourse in Antiquity might impact that, because of course, one of the big dishonours that a man might experience would be for a female relative to experience sexual violation. And you can see that maybe the private-public division isn't just rooted in certain cultural preferences, but it's rooted in a kind of therapeutic response to a world in which sexual violation was a living possibility for nearly all women. And no one doubts that this particular way of living would be profoundly limiting for the women concerned. But it is worth trying to situate some of these ideas in an ancient context. So why have I mentioned this? It's just to say, Philo is a really good example for Paul because they're roughly contemporaneous, not quite, but roughly. They are engaging with similar issues. They're both living out a Jewish identity of one sort or another in Greco-Roman cities. Philo was in Alexandria, Paul in the cities of Asia Minor and Greece. And so, Philo is nearly always a good cultural illustration for how different Jews navigated Greco-Roman ideas. And we see here that in their treatment of men and women, the Jews weren't radically different. And this might have some bearing on how Paul navigates male and female attire during worship, which we imagine would be in a domestic setting that has been temporarily repurposed. One last text, and this is from the patristic writer Clement of Alexandria, and it's from a text called Pedagogos, and this is from Pedagogos, Book 3, Section 3. And I'm just referencing this because I think it includes some interesting language about the differences between men and women. So this is Clement basically telling the young Christian men that he's writing to that they shouldn't shave and go to the barbers, and they should be very careful about not bathing too much. Why? It's an odd sort of thing to say to us. But why? What are the assumptions that Clement is making about men and women and how they work? Not just socially, not just culturally, not just relationally, but also biologically. What are the biological assumptions that ancient writers factored in? Well, firstly, Clement is rooting some of his ideas in relation to Genesis, probably Genesis 2. Whatever smoothness and softness was in him, the first man, God abstracted from his side when he formed the woman, Eve, physically receptive, his partner in parentage, his help in household management, while he, for he had parted with all smoothness, remained a man and shows himself man. And so there what you've got is, you've got Clement alluding to Genesis, but also alluding to, elements that that we could recognise from Aristotle or Philo about the relationship between men and women within a household context. And to the man has been assigned action as to her suffering. So action. Isn't it interesting how Philo, when he was talking about separate spheres of behaviour, said, men should be talking about war and peace and things like that. And what is shaggy is drier and warmer than what is smooth. So there's a difference in temperature between men and women. Now, one of the interesting things, if you ever get round to reading Dale Martin's commentary on the Corinthian body, we'll find that ancient assumptions about biology assumed that men were drier and hotter than women, and that this was a physical, biological property rather than just a kind of coincidence. So males have both more hair and more heat than females. Animals that are entire than the emasculated. Now what's going on there? Clement is regarding women as kind of emasculated men. Perfect and imperfect. He's not talking morally, he is talking completeness. Completeness. It's therefore impious to desecrate the symbol of manhood, which is hairiness. In other words, if you shave or cut your hair in an effeminate way, according to Clement, you're signalling that you're somehow less. So why have I mentioned this? Because we see in Clement that what we've got is he's reading Genesis, but he's reading Genesis in the light of Greco-Roman assumptions about behaviour, but he's also reading Genesis in the light of Greco-Roman assumptions about male and female biology. And so, is it possible that some of the assumptions that Paul makes about why it's important that women veil, 1 Corinthians 11, 7 through 10, is it possible that lingering in the background are certain assumptions about biology? Certainly, in 1 Corinthians 11, verses 11 and 12, Paul refers to human reproduction as one of the ways, as one of the frames of reference that he's bringing to the question of how men and women ought to behave. So it would be odd if there weren't some biological assumptions that Paul was making. So these are just a few texts. We've had Genesis text. I'm going to put you on full screen. We've had a Genesis text. We've had a text from Aristotle. We've had a text from Philo of Alexandria, and we've had a text from Clement of Alexandria. These are some of the texts which show that when ancients thought about men and women, they thought across multiple frames. There were myths or stories, like the Genesis story. And I don't use myth in a way to signal untrue. I mean a foundational story. There were also models and metaphors, and there were also biological assumptions. And so let's leave it there.